Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of the AI era. I'm Kasralian, and in this podcast, I talk about the new world that we are heading towards. The world where humans do not have a monopoly or dominance on intelligence. In my discussions about AI, I have heard from many that AI is just an imitator of the data that is fed to it, and it does not have any kind of creativity or intelligence of its own. In some senses, they consider AI a parrot that repeats what it heard without knowing what it says. In this episode of the AI era, I try to address the topic of whether AI is just an imitating parrot or an authentic creator. Well, first of all, it would be beneficial to systematically break down creation versus imitation. To do that, let's start with an example in the realm of art. A painting drawn in Picasso's style today will be considered an imitation, even if the painting is more impressive and detailed than the original works of Picasso. The reason is that the artistic community put value in the idea and the style that Picasso came up with, not necessarily about how impressive the painting is. So, at least in the artistic context, what defines creation versus imitation is not necessarily about how good is the end product. It is about where does the idea and the style come from. If it's from yourself, then it's authentic and you're creative. If you just learn the patterns and repeated them, you're not creative. But what if a painter's style is a combination of the styles of two other painters? Is the artist still an imitator? What if it combines the styles of 5 other painters? Wouldn't that be a new style of its own? I mean, every artist gets inspired and influenced by the work of the other artists. Would that mean they're imitating? Essentially, the main question here is, what would define the border between imitation and creation? Because it's not always an obvious cut. To answer that question, it would be beneficial to unpack the procedure of how someone creates an authentic idea or approach. First, one gets exposed to the inputs and information available. Then, one learns about the patterns in those information and inputs. After that, one processes those inputs to make sense of them and find their patterns. If the inputs are high quality, and the processing is done well, then the found patterns could be used to synthesize the inputs and come up with something entirely new. Let's go over an example. Graham Bell was exposed to information about sound waves as a teacher for the deaf. Also, he was exposed to the information about how telegraphs converts dots and dashes into electrical signals. He processed his inputs and found patterns in the similarities between sound waves and telegraph signals. Then, he synthesized all his knowledge about those fields and invented the telephone. In fact, having more inputs and knowing more has little to do with creation. Also, finding patterns within inputs is valuable for predicting and recreating the inputs, but it does not necessarily lead to creation per se. The creation happens when something entirely new that is quite different from its inputs appears. But at the same time, the creation process starts from some inputs in different forms. Graham Bell had different scientific and experimental inputs that led to the invention of the telephone, and so did Picasso. He had much input, including his education and other paintings he had seen during his career. But we all agree that their creations were way more than the combination of their inputs. Going back to the question of the boundary between creation and imitation, it is safe to say that when the inputs are synthesized to the level that they are no longer breakable into their input pieces, the creation has happened. It is almost impossible to break down the nuances of Picasso's style to his education or experiences throughout his life. His surrealistic style is a synthesis of all his career life, which actually started with realism. Also, it is impossible to break down pieces of telephone invention into some Graham Bell's particular experiences or pieces of knowledge. So, in summary, if the output is breakable and attributable to the individual components of the inputs, the output is an imitation, and otherwise, it could be considered a creation. Now, we can answer the question of whether AI is just an imitating parrot or an authentic creator. For AIs, the inputs are their training data, and the processing and possible knowledge synthesis is the model training procedure. With that in mind, we can frame our question like this. Are AI outputs breakable and attributable to their individual training data points? The scientific answer to that question is no. So AI can be assumed to be an authentic creator. The outputs of the model cannot be directly associated with its individual training data, even though the outcomes are based on the patterns found in the training data. In other words, an AI model extracts the patterns within the training data and uses those patterns to synthesize its outputs. A very good supporter of my argument is that the most capable large language models have a size of about just 1 terabyte. That's right, you can carry a model that knows almost everything about the world in your external hard. That's a good indicator that these AI models have learned the essence and patterns of knowledge in the world, and their size represents that extracted essence, not all the information available on the world. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit into just 1 terabyte. With that said, it is important to mention again that these models learn patterns from their training data, so even though the outputs could not be directly associated with individual inputs, they are still a product of those inputs. Pretty much like the art style of Picasso, which is a product of Picasso's inputs throughout his life. And the story is the same with the telephone and Graham Bell's life. So, if AI is actually an authentic creator, what comes to the jobs of us humans in the coming years? After all, if AI can create, what would be left to be done by humans? In the next episodes, I will talk about which jobs and roles will survive the AI wave ahead of us. And yes, there will be many roles that survive the AI wave. Alright. That was all for this episode, and until the next, adapt and evolve.